Welcome back, everyone. We're now going to move on and have a look at autoimmune disease. We're going to start by looking at the causes of autoimmune disease in general, and then we'll focus in a little bit more closely on three different autoimmune disorders. So Crohn's disease, myasthenia gravis, and systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, or more commonly just known as lupus. The immune system is attacking self-antigens. So the immune system in some way or another is seeing self-antigens as foreign and mounting an immune response to it. This will result, of course, in tissue damage. Now, some autoimmune diseases sort of just target a specific tissue. For example, myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune condition that involves the motor end plate. Crohn's disease is a autoimmune condition of the digestive tract, and mostly it is limited to the digestive tract, although there may be, sometimes systemic issues. But some autoimmune diseases involve multiple tissues. So rheumatoid arthritis, usually people just think about that in terms of joints, but there are, as the disease sort of progresses, there are systemic effects of this, and we're going to talk about that more in the inflammation topic. And systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, or lupus, this is a disease that does involve multiple tissues, and it's because it's called systemic, the hint there is in its name. In terms then of possible causes of autoimmune disease, there is a genetic predisposition in terms of the HLA type that you have inherited. Remember, HLA is human leukocyte antigen. It's the same as MHC. So remember, these little molecules that are on the surface of our cells that present antigen to the immune system. So it has been shown that, people with certain HLA types, they are kind of more predisposed to developing an autoimmune disease. Now, just because they have this particular type doesn't mean they will get a particular autoimmune disease, but there is an increased risk if they're also exposed to a particular environmental agent. The second one then is molecular mimicry, where exposure to a foreign antigen that is very similar to a host antigen. So this can occur if somebody is exposed to a foreign antigen, right? That's going to stimulate an immune response. Now, usually when levels of that foreign antigen then decrease, the immune response is switched off. But with molecular mimicry, the immune cells and the chemical mediators keep attacking self-antigen because it's very similar to the foreign antigen that stimulated the immune response to begin with. And of course, that's going to cause tissue damage. The third one then is exposure to self-antigens that are normally not exposed to immune cells. For example, joint destruction. Now, there are molecules inside the joint that the immune system doesn't normally see. But if a joint gets destroyed, then the immune cells can kind of enter the joint, and then they will recognize those antigens as foreign and mount an immune response to them. Similarly, with tissue necrosis, there are molecules inside cells, again, that the immune system doesn't see. Very often these are inside the nucleus. So when necrosis occurs, those molecules then will enter the plasma, and the immune system has no tolerance to them and therefore will mount an immune response. The next possible cause of autoimmune disease is loss of T-cell energy. Now, very simplistically, T-cell energy describes a situation where we have T cells that recognize our self-antigen, but they're not activated. They don't proliferate. So normally they're not going to attack our own self-antigen. But here we're getting a loss of T cell energy. So tissues start to express cytokines that normally wouldn't. And this can be caused via, tissue necrosis. So cells dying off, or inflammation, or infection. So what happens here is these cells kind of dying off will stimulate T cells to proliferate, and therefore, when they shouldn't, and that's then going to cause that damage. And the final possible cause is due to these super antigens. And these super antigens are antigens that can directly interact with T cells. So normally the antigen needs to be presented by an antigen presenting cell, but these super antigens, some bacterial toxins act as super antigens, for example, botulism toxin, they can actually directly interact with T cells. Now, autoimmune diseases are often stimulated by infections or exposure to allergens. And this could occur due to molecular mimicry, so that foreign antigen and host antigen being similar. An example of this is a protein from a bacteria called Streptococcus pyogenes that, causes the production of autoantibodies that then cross-react with heart myosin to lead to heart damage. The next one then is tissue damage due to initial inflammation and then loss of that T cell energy that I just mentioned. The third one then is bacterial exotoxins or other foreign antigens acting as those super antigens. So remember, exotoxins are toxins that are released from bacteria. So sometimes people might eat food that contains one of these exotoxins in it. So the person's not actually infected, but because the exotoxin is in the food, they may sort of be predisposed to autoimmune disease, and then that could be the trigger for the development of the autoimmune disease. Now, another example given here is reactive arthritis, which is initiated by a gastrointestinal or genitourinary bacterial infection. And for some people that end up with this form of arthritis from this infection, it could be resolved pretty quickly. Whereas for other people, it could last years and years after that initial infection. Now, often the tissue damage that occurs with autoimmune disease involves the abnormal accumulation of these antibody-antigen complexes and then stimulation of the complement system and inflammation. Now, remember, we had the IgE antibody that was the driver of the immediate hypersensitivity reactions. Well, here with autoimmune disease, we're talking about IgM antibodies and IgG antibodies. IgM antibodies are these large antibodies here that are the first type of antibody that's produced in response to an infection. And then these IgG antibodies afterwards are the most common antigen then that is involved in both bacterial and viral infections. So what you can have then are these, antibody-antigen complexes that form when these antibodies bind to the antigens, and they form in the circulation and they damage blood vessel walls or any other tissues that they enter. And unfortunately, these complexes can accumulate in the glomerulus, which is that network of capillaries in the nephron, to then, stimulate inflammation and damage. And over time, then that can lead to chronic kidney disease. So here we have our 5 classes of antibodies: IgG, IgM, IgA, IgE, and IgD. You can see that they all consist of 4 proteins. We have these 2 in dark green that are larger proteins, and this is why they're called heavy chain. And then we have lighter green ones that are smaller proteins, and they're called light chains, right? But they're all 4 proteins attached together. So each antibody then can bind to 2 antigens. And IgG and IgM are the antibodies that are involved in autoimmune disorders. IgA is found in secretions such as tears, mucus, and saliva. IgE, as we've previously mentioned, is involved in those immediate hypersensitivity reactions. And IgD then only makes up about sort of 1% of all immunoglobulins, and it's found in the plasma membrane of immature lymphocytes. And just a little bit of revision here, we're looking at a nephron. Here's the glomerulus. Remember, this is where the first step of urine formation takes place in terms of glomerular filtration. So if you can imagine these antibody-antigen complexes all building up inside these little fragile sort of capillaries, that's going to cause damage, and it's also going to cause inflammation. And because they're clogging up the capillaries, you're not going to get sufficient glomerular filtration, and over time, then that's going to lead to not being able to regulate fluid and electrolyte balance.